just as a postscript, as we're getting settled in, Canadian and Polish military cooperation. The Canadian brigade was in northern Germany in the late 50s, early 60s. I was a Hussar, cavalry officer, but in tanks. And we were part of the British Army of the Rhine. And part of the British Army of the Rhine was the Tank Transporter Battalion. Guess who ran the Transporter Battalion? They were Polish. And they had it just like that. And they could move a tank regiment in 20 minutes. They would line up at a T-junction with the trucks on one side, 50 of these big, huge trucks, and the tanks on the other side. One truck would go by and a tank would follow. Another truck would go by until all 40 tanks had gone by behind a truck, and then in 20 minutes all the trucks were on, chained down, and the Polish took us away, and they'd always end up beside a pub. Always. And here we were, 20 feet off the ground, and the Poles were the first guys in the pub.
What's your name, sir? Please say your name.
Mike Charrier.
Thank you so much.
Hussar.
Thank you so much.
I've been to Poland many times, and I've seen the way Poles drive, so I'm not surprised.
If I may just add to that, in the British Army today, there's a unit in the Royal Logistics Corps, 7th Transport Regiment. Its tax sign is the Polish eagle with a crown, and they have it on the back of all of their vehicles to this day, in remembrance of that Polish transporting British tanks.
And they know every pub. They know every pub in continental Europe.
It's probably, to nie jest wielka niespodzianka, but it probably is. It's coincident.
Thank you for this testimonial.
That's in 2 hours.
Dobrze?
Bardzo dobrze.
Proszę Państwa, nie szybuję jeszcze raz będę.
Next, any more questions? Please.
So what happened to the veterans who fought on the Commonwealth side after the war? Did most go back to Poland, or did they come to the West?
Who would like to take this question? Professor Kramer?
What was the question? So after the Second World War, a lot of Polish troops stayed in the UK. What happened to them after the war? Did they return or did they come?
There was a problem of their future because they ought to be disarmed after the ceasing of the hostilities, and the British government proposed the so-called Corps of Resettlement for the Polish former soldiers in 1946, and they had some possibilities to be prepared for civilian war, for civilian life in the United Kingdom. There was also a problem of the communist government action, communist government in Warsaw, and in the Polish Provisional Government of National Unity, as it was called after its establishment in Moscow in summer 45, and communist government tried to get them to Poland, but only, if I remember, it was only 15% of these soldiers who wanted to come to the country, which was under Soviet domination. And after the general elections in January 47, the communist dictatorship was established in Warsaw, and there was no choice for them. Large majority of Polish soldiers decided to live in the free world, and this was the decision which permitted for some calculations during the Cold War for re-establishment of Polish army, especially General Anders had such ideas during the summit of the Cold War, I mean the Korean conflict in 1950 especially. And you know, the further war appeared unfortunately impossible. The detente policy after the death of Stalin created new international situation. But Polish emigre authorities were preserved, Polish government in London, and this was the conception of so-called legalism, political legalism in Polish political thought of this time. Thank you.
Can I add something? You can as what I understand, I'm still not a historian, but I understand in 1947 the Majesty Queen appointed General Alexander, the Marshal of the Mediterranean front or army, to be the General Governor of Canada, and very quickly the situation changed. So the first action wave of the Polish soldiers, immigrant officer, arrived to Canada, to Halifax. It was precisely 4,800 of them, and that was the next wave. So the General Alexander know that he really appreciated the efforts of the Polish command, Polish soldiers during the Italy campaign. He was very close to and met occasionally many times with General Alexander. I understand also that General Sosenkowski, who spent a lot of time around Montreal, he also established pretty good contact with the new General Governor, General Alexander. So definitely his diplomacy, his skills, and his personal connections with General Alexander, the new General Governor, helped bring the Polish people, Polish soldiers to Canada. Between 45 and 47, there was a lot of objections on the British side. I understand in 47 there was still Canada as a British subject. General Williams, yes?
Yes,
Yes.
1st of January 47.
There were some objections in Canada. I don't want to go deeply into these topics. It's a politically or diplomatic. I now feel comfortable to discuss, but there were some objections. In 47, dramatically changed the situation that allowed the Polish soldiers to immigrate to Canada.
So how many came? How many Polish soldiers total came to Canada after? Is there a number on that?
And how many stayed there? And what happened to them?
We're in UK and France,
Those
but
who
it is
stayed
true.
in Poland or came back to Poland.
Or most of them been right away put to the jail, and a lot of
Exactly,
them
Yes, maybe we should talk.
regime, and some of them been hanged, shot to the head. So it's a really terrible treatment by the country.
Maybe I'll follow with a question about the cursed soldiers. I think that's the right segue right now, and because and also, as we like to call them, steadfast soldiers. So who would like to take that question?
The first group that came, as mentioned, was approximately 4,800 Polish officers and soldiers. And the Canadian External Affairs recruiting team went to visit General Anders in 2nd Corps with criteria they had established in Canada. First, the officers couldn't be married. That's a bit ridiculous given the 2nd Corps and the families. Second, they could never have served in the German army. Anders said, unacceptable. 25% of my soldiers were conscripted into the German army. They're old. And they had to be healthy based on those criteria. And so these things were worked through, and that was the first wave, and eventually families could join after hosting. The Polish Resettlement Corps, one of the, I won't say key planners, but one of the proponents, strangely enough, is one of those vignettes of history, is there was a Royal Artillery Major who was adamant that the Poles should be repatriated to wherever they wished to go. And one of his memorandums I found in the archives in Canada, even though he's not Canadian, and he said, you can send me as many Poles as you want. Keep pumping me Poles until the cows come home. We can accommodate as many that will come. And this fellow's name is Major Dennis Thatcher, Margaret's husband, artillery officer during the war. As far as how many went back to Poland, it's estimated about 12%. And some of the people that my good friend Edward Poznanski mentioned, like Vito Pilecki, was put to death in 1948 in Poland. Many patriots who were in the Polish army in the West were killed. Some returned to service after in the Air Force. Some people like Skabinski joined the Army. There were others, but many suffered a very fate of death, punishment in the worst possible manner. So the incentive was certainly not to go there. The first arrival, the wave that came, was joined by many others. The exact number, I don't know. I've been trying to figure out that for about the last 8 years. How many did come to Canada? And in the last number of years, our census records are more restricted in Canada as far as country of origin, and you can't actually access them as easily as one could in the past. So where did somebody come from, and how long have they been here? So that answer is the perfect question to which I don't have an answer, but I am trying to figure out as well how many came here, because without a doubt, on a qualitative aspect, our country is much richer for having this incredible contribution. But quantitatively, I don't know. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to my colleague.
Yeah, I can say a few words because I studied based on, of course, on information from Polish government in exile, and I think it's roughly, you can say that this was combined with civilian wave to Canada, so it's very difficult to differentiate who were civilian or who were people who were in displaced camps, okay, in the Western Europe, and but I think it was minimum altogether came from the West to Canada, from the Western Europe, about 100,000 or more, okay, of Poles who were displaced, and some of them, they were soldiers of the Polish armed forces in the West. I must say that one of the brothers, my uncle, brother of my father, who was in 3 concentration camps, starting with Auschwitz, then Buchenwald, and then Flensburg, escaped from the 3rd one and crossed the line of the front, joined Magic Division. He was very fit like all Jablonskis. And he fought after 3, he was in combat action against the Germans. And he decided, he was very young, he was not officer, so he had an affair with a Belgian girl, but it didn't work out. And he decided to come back. So he came back in one of the transport ships. I don't know who provided transport ship for the Polish soldiers. My father went to Szczecin to meet with him. So the full ship came with the Polish soldiers from the West. They were in British uniforms. So the Poles were really very happy because they were thinking, well, the Western are coming finally. We are here in the communist regime, and of course they were warned immediately to change the combat because they could be arrested and so on. But essentially, this prosecution was directed mainly to officers, not as much to the common soldiers, but it depends, of course. And what was very awful that the Polish communist government, puppet government, stripped from the Polish citizenship all generals and all higher rank officers. Of course, you know, the Polish citizenship of the Polish communist Poland is not the same as the free Poland, but it was felt very deeply in heart of this Poles who fought, you know, during the war, and they were stripped from the Polish citizenship. And eventually all of them, they got rehabilitated when the Polish was resurrected in 1989.
Maybe we should add that today was a funeral at 11 a.m., I think, at the Polish parish over here of Mr. Franz, who is one of the examples of soldiers stripped from the Polish citizenship, and he has never regained it later on. Next question, please. Please, Stasiek.
Professor Konrad, you are an expert on the history of diplomacy, amongst other things, concerning the years preceding the World War II. The agreement between the Polish military and Polish diplomats and the Brits and the French was basically a sound scenario. That is, that whoever is going to be attacked, the other side is going to enter the war, and that was mutual defense, which required both sides to get engaged within a couple of weeks. But it didn't work out. My question is, could you give us any details of these conversations that took place? How these agreements went, what was actually agreed on in detail, and which side was actually pushing for the alliance? Because I thought that maybe the West should be more interested in bringing Poland into it than the vice versa, because Poland had an option maybe of smoothing things out with the Germans and somehow hope to survive. While the West, if not for Poland, the West probably would lose a lot more, maybe the war, if Poland was not involved. So my question is, how did we end up with something that didn't work?
Thank you very much for this question. In my lecture, I tried to limit myself to the more general remarks, and I think that I can give you some detailed information. First of all, we must remember that Poland entered in the crisis of 1939 only with one alliance. It was the alliance with France, of course. It was concluded in 1921 in Paris, and it was modified in Locarno in 1925 by the second defense treaty, guarantee treaty between both governments. And they were, of course, juridically valid, but the situation in 1939 was absolutely different in comparison with the realities of the beginning of 20s. This was the situation for spring 1939, when British Prime Minister Chamberlain proclaimed his declaration on the guarantees to Poland. Britain became the second Polish ally, but we must highlight one question, I think. Polish-British mutual obligations were only political. There was no military convention between Poland and Britain, and no military agreement between Poland and Britain. We can take into account two documents. First of them is the provisional protocol of April the 7th, dated for April the 7th, 1939, in which we had only political conditions of the alliance. It was secret, it was top secret for both governments, and it was composed with 11, if I remember, points. It was named by Polish ambassador to London, Edward Raczyński, punktacja. Punktacja, this is the special diplomatic language. In this protocol, we had such stipulation, for instance, that the war, both countries will be engaged in the defensive war against Germany, and that they will not conclude any armistice or peace without consultation of the partner. This was written in this document, for instance. Secondly, it was said that in case of German attack, local attack on Gdańsk, Britain will enter in the war in case of Polish military engagement to defend free city of Gdańsk and the Polish rights in the free city of Gdańsk. We had two military missions, British missions to Poland. In May, mission under General Clayton, and in July, the General Inspector of British Army, Ironside, visited Warsaw. The discussions between British military mission and Polish general staff, especially General Stachiewicz, Wacław Stachiewicz, who was the chief of the staff, the conclusions were written on paper in protocols, and these protocols were published in London in the end of 50s. But these protocols signified no concrete military obligations of British Army. General Ironside made some allusions concerning future British military operations against Germany. He said, for instance, that in case of war, it is not excluded that British military aircraft will be sent to Poland. Or secondly, he mentioned that British Army will send expeditionary corps to France, composed with 4 divisions. It was not exact. Britain had no 4 divisions prepared for sending to France. And these conversations did not clear up the situation of military obligations of Britain. But concerning France's situation is radically different. As I mentioned in my lecture, on April 13, Prime Minister Daladier declared that France will be bound by the same obligations to Poland as Britain is after Chamberlain Declaration. That France is a guaranteeing power of Polish independence. And in May 1939, Polish military mission under General Tadeusz Kaczyński, who was defense minister, was sent to Paris, and they discussed, General Gamelin, French commander-in-chief of the army, and Kaczyński. And a special military protocol Gamelin-Kaczyński was concluded for May 1939, of course. And this protocol was very concrete, and it was said that immediately after German aggression on Poland, because it was sure that in May 1939 it was sure that German aggression will be not in the West but against Poland. It was sure. Before decisive conversations between Hitler and Beck in January 1939, there were calculations or discussions between diplomats in London and in Paris, and they discussed the possibility of the German aggression in the West. But in April and in May, situation was clear. Poland was in the most dangerous position. And coming back to the protocol. In the protocol it was said that immediately after the German attack on Poland, the French government will declare the war. French government said that only after the declaration of the war, the general mobilization of the French army will be possible. No earlier, because in case of general mobilization earlier, it would be a pretext, very comfortable pretext to Hitler to open the war as it was in 1914. You remember that Russia declared general mobilization in 1914 in July, and Germany sent an ultimatum to the government of Russia in St. Petersburg, and the war was declared. And to avoid such a situation, French government wanted to had the possibility to start general mobilization only after the declaration of war. For general mobilization, French government, French commandant-in-chief of the army wanted 15 days. But it was said in this protocol also three things more. That immediately after the declaration of the war, limited operations on the land are possible, limited operations. Secondly, that immediately the operations of the French aviation and British aviation is possible. Operations are possible. And ultimately, on the 15th day of general mobilization, it was said that on this day, 15th day of mobilization, of general mobilization, the general counter-offensive on the Western Front will be possible. And this was military protocol. This military protocol was connected with the political protocol, which was also negotiated, but was not concluded until September 4th. And in this situation, what can we say? We can say that French government did only one thing, declared the war on September 3rd, 2 hours after British declaration of the war. No immediate operation of the aviation took place. No limited operation. It is the problem of the limited operation on the land is discussive because, as you probably know, on September the 7th, French army started to operate on Moselle these small action on the territories which were not covered by the Siegfried Line. But one thing must be remembered. Before the decisive negotiations between Gamelin and Kasprzycki in May, French and British general staff of the armies decided that in the future war, the fate of Poland will be the function of the general result of the conflict, and that in the first phase of the war, there will be no opening of the Western Front. It is a protocol, French-British protocol, which was dated for 4th and 5th May 1939. We have contradiction, complete contradiction between the decision taken by the general staffs at the beginning of May and the stipulations of the protocol, Kasprzycki-Gamelin. What could we say? What could historians say on it? I think that we can say that British and French governments decided to make offer of military help to Poland without any idea to keep them in force in case of war. Why they did so? I think they wanted to give Poland some kind of military moral support, some kind of moral support only, without military cover for them. And this is my opinion. After the war, General Gamelin wrote his memoirs. They are entitled Servir, służyć in Polish. And he wrote that he did all what was possible from his side, because he had no possibility to start any successful operations against German army, because Polish campaign was ended after two weeks, and he had no possibility to start the military operation on the Western Front on 17th of September this day, Red Army entered to Poland. And he said that this operation on Moselle, it was the operation signifying this limited land action, limited action on the land. Thank you very much for
Any next question?
How did Polish forces make up their losses? Because I know even for us with the Canadian forces, when we were losing so many casualties in Northwest Europe, that it was a big problem for us to keep the numbers up. But Poland didn't have access to its manpower. So what happened with the casualties? How were they able to refill the units?
Right, thank you. And one of the issues besides the horrific loss of Polish forces, I look at 1st Polish Armored Div and then 3rd and 5th Divisions in 2nd Corps. Was an army in exile, you don't have the manpower, you pointed absolute. And in particular in Northwestern Europe, policy was to triage the German prisoners of war to find out how many of them were Poles who had been conscripted into the German army. And in that case, Maciek was able to augment his forces over 8 months with over 1,000 soldiers. And so put into Polish uniforms and fight. Now, so the tragedy of all of that is that some of these people were killed soon after. So the records, whatever happened to these individuals, nobody knows. But that was one way they attempted to do that. The issues of the diaspora was to, as mentioned, Edward and I both mentioned that, where South America, Canada, etc., only so many were available who weren't already in uniform. I looked at a statistic for the American Army in the Second World War. 12% of the American Army of 11 million was of Polish descent. So there's over 1 million of Polish descent in the American Army in the Second War. So huge. So those resources have already been tapped. So when Maciek, after the Battle of Falaise Gap, there was a rest and recuperation period. The commanders, when they came under British Corps command and later on back to 2nd Corps Canadian under Simmons, they knew they were getting a reduced division, reduced in numbers. The tanks they could replace and reinforce with that, but the numbers were lower. So when, after Falaise, they lost 20% of the fighting power, that hurts. So then you have, your battalions are going in as reduced battalions. Commanders do that, and the Poles were not alone. The Canadian battalions were reduced as well by that time. So for the planning, it had to be clear that you've got a division on paper, but it's not a fully manned division. So you cannot assume that it can operate as a division or cover an area encompassed by a division. So for captured prisoners of war, and then certainly in the Italian campaign with the 2nd Corps, all the activities in Palestine, the Polish army in the desert, and the Nazi where you have the youth are being trained, and as soon as they attain age, they're in the army, but you're not putting children into the army, nor should you. But the paramilitary training increased. But a factor that Poland, much like, strangely enough, the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force under General Freyberg, it's a limited resource. There are no reinforcements. Once they're gone, they're gone. So the national card, when General Sikorski was alive, is important to say, we're willing to fight. Well, at certain losses, we're going to be not combat capable. Maciek never raised that, neither did Anders. They were willing to continue the fight. There was never a complaint about we're not combat ready. They were always ready. They made it clear, that Maciek in particular, that we're reduced in numbers, but we're still happy to go.
Yes, if I may, in terms of the general Anders 2nd Corps, it was the smallest corps from Alliance in 1944, and the end of the Italian campaign raised to the top, almost 120,000, so like a second corps was ready. Most of them was POW, so from Silesia, from Śląsk, as well as from Pomerania, Pomorze, people being forced to the German army. And all of them voluntarily joined the Maciek army or Anders. So there was not any force. There was, of course, political officer to announce who willing to join the Polish army, and also have to take sort of interrogation or whatever they call
Well,
it.
they do a triage to make sure
triage,
that they had
see.
voluntarily joined, because the point I mentioned about when the interviewers came over from Canada, 25% of 2nd Corps had been in the German army at
That's
one
right.
point. So they weren't voluntarily in the German army. They wanted to confirm that in the interviews. You were conscripted from Pomorska Schloss, whatever part of Poland, you were conscripted.
Yeah. And I was really fight against the German army in Italy, really very brave. That's the same with General Matrek. So there was the Czarne Diabły, the Black Tiger, whatever they call it, the Black Devils. So really very effective, and they're really very proud. And some of them raised to the rank of the officer. So not very quickly, but they raised to the officer. I met few of them in Pomerania, in Kashub. So they told the story how they've been forced. The situation like this, you have to do jail Farsi, if not, we'll take your mother or grandfather to the jail and eventually put to the square floor. So voluntary, no, they didn't volunteer. Right. Most of them, they maybe had something happen, but they forced. But if they happen situation completely change and they've been approached by the Polish officer, then joined as a volunteers to Anderson as well as the Massacre.
Right, and
if I can, before I turn it over to Edward, Piszczynowski, who's left for today, his job in 1945 was to go through, he was in Norway with a small merry band to visit all of the 500,000 Germans who were still there, army, and to go into the camps and find out where the Poles were. And he became literally like the Pied Piper of Bremen, where huge numbers following. I talked about one camp where at least 100 were Poles, so they're in the ranks, not voluntarily. I'll turn it over to Edward.
So thank you for your question. It's a great question. I think, as both Robert and I mentioned, the big challenge for Polish military contribution to the Second World War was that it was undertaken primarily as an exiled nation. So right away, there's certain limitations. So in addition to these attempted recruitment movements in North and South America, I mean, Poland did get lucky, if I can put it that way, that the Polish prisoners of war in the Soviet Union were released by Stalin, and they were able to, and the civilians were able to come out. So that was an unexpected sort of replenishment of forces. And I think there's been, I won't get into all the other military unit details, but there's two things I want to cover that are often ignored. So number one, it's the Polish Home Army, the resistance movement. That was like 500,000 fighting men and women, and we can't forget that as part of the Polish military effort. It was a recognized Polish military effort. And the second thing that maybe is less talked about today are the Polish forces in the east, those under Soviet command. So they also had replenishment issues, and don't forget the enormous casualties, far higher than what the Polish forces were in the west. Now they had the advantage, as they moved into Polish territory, they were basically able to conscript, recruit, force, and even home army soldiers that said maybe now they will cooperate with the Red Army or whatever. They were forced into the Polish army, as were the Armia Ludowa resistance movement. So it was perhaps even a little bit more brutal in terms of the Polish forces in the east, but it was a huge problem for both forces in the west and the east. But as I say, a major contribution, or something we can't overlook, is the Polish Home Army itself.
Yeah. And sorry, if I can, one last comment. On the soldiers coming from once released and heading south through Iran, through Palestine, one of the best I've ever read accounts of that is by Yusuf Chupsky it's called Inhumane Land. Chupsky, unbelievable account that would stagger most people, but the undying spirit of the Poles who were trying to get to that army they heard was being formed. An extraordinary book. It's been republished in English, so I recommend for those who have friends who might want to read about it. It is an amazing account, the best I've ever read.
There was a very, I would say, expression by the Polish and Canadian soldiers. The Burrs, the chief commander of the Canadian forces in Italy, by the Colin Anders, and they told always that the Poles and Canadians, it's the participation without representation. At the end of the, I would say, 43, 44, actually, the Canadian made it. They formed on 1st Canadian Army under Canadian command. The Poles in Italy was still part of, I don't know, the British, the American, even in case of Anders, he's still preserved on command, which means the only Anders can direct, command, and rule, and be engaged in a conflict under the Anders command. I don't know to what extent there was given the freedom under the agreement between Kerry and General Sosnkowski. They met in England about 2-3 weeks before the D-Day. To what extent they agreed, we don't know. There is no any written statement from Sosnkowski as well as from Kerry. They met in headquarters, they discussed. I understand was much more commanded by the general, but was still independent. Anders in Italy have full independence. Okay, so there was one time when he actually had a second thought if he's ready to go to Monte Cassino. Because of the political pressure, we know that the Poland being sold to the Russian or Soviet by the British and Americans at the time, a few weeks before the Monte Cassino. There was a very, I would say, first of all discussions between Anders and Sosnkowski. Sosnkowski was not ready to push the Polish soldiers to Monte Cassino. The Anders say, well, we have to prove. We have to prove. We are ready. So General Clark gave a few hours to write to the General Anders to think about. So he was back saying, we'll be ready. In a few days we go to Monte Cassino. So he was quite independent in the command of the Polish forces. In case of Massacre, I think he was much more coordinated on the top level. That's all.
I just have to say one word about post-war era, immediately after Second World War. I don't know if anybody knows it, that American Army organized so-called guard companies to guard military, industrial, and also other hubs in the portion of Germany occupied by the USA. And in these guard companies, in the maximum level of the Polish former soldiers from underground, or essentially who decided to volunteer to this unit, to this American Army unit, they came up to almost 70,000. So there were 70,000 former Polish soldiers or Poles who joined the U.S. Army in this effort. And it's also very forgotten, about what happened to. Then I like to mention also a huge effort in Great Britain for evacuation and displacement of all Polish soldiers who stay in the Great Britain, because they were housed in special camps through many counties. And in fact, Major Pieszczanowski was one of the commander of one section of this kind of camps. And these camps these soldiers were trained to be accommodated in Britain or to immigrate to Canada or another countries, okay? And some of them, they went to Canada. I think there is not enough research being done, both in the West and also in Poland, about these cases. Another tragic thing is that not only Germans took conscripted Poles, but also from annexed territories, Russians, Soviets, they conscripted Poles. There were about 200,000 Poles. And I remember the father of my friend, who is now still alive, over 90 years old. He was conscripted by the Soviets, and then was taken as a prisoner of war by Germans. Most of them, they got killed because the conditions in the German camps for POW from the Soviet army, from the Red Army, was tragic. But he somehow survived to 1945. So in 1945, in this portion that then his camp was, there were not many left, but he knew English. So he decided to get civilian code and try to see anybody, because Americans, they were herding these Russians and they putting them back to to the Red Army. The Red Army was killing them almost immediately, okay? So he was trying to escape, and he met someone and said, I am Polish, I am Polish. He said, well, but you are from the Red Army camp, you can't be Polish. They said, well, I'm Polish. So this was his survival. And there were some Poles who survived because they know some foreign languages. Otherwise, they will be handed by British or American back to the Soviet, and they will immediately killed.
Yes, I'd like to pause right now before the last two questions, because I would like to ask two gentlemen.
But I think we have.
Yes, we'll be wrapping up after the next two questions, but you know, I'd like to pause for a second because this gentleman's father was recently decorated, and he actually was the mechanic for the division, for the Squadron 303 in Great Britain. I'd like to ask you to say a couple of words about your father.
Yes, my father was one of the refugees who left Siberia to end up in Tehran eventually, and then be taken over to Britain, be taken into the RAF, and he was a mechanic on Mustangs and Mosquitoes, just Mustangs, during in 303 Squadron. And just recently he was awarded the Polonia Restituta medal, and he's very proud of that. I think it was awarded for his contributions to the Polish community and as a businessman growing a business in southern Ontario.
What's his name?
As Józef Palimonka.
Thank you very much. So let's continue. Let's continue, Pani Hania.
My last question.
Pani Hania first, because she raised the hand first.
Sorry.
I have a very short question. It's kind of a follow-up to what you said about the recruitment of Canadians of Polish background into the Polish army. Any such thing happened with the very many American soldiers of Polish background? Were they able to join the Polish forces as opposed to fight within the British forces?
Yeah. They could, but they had to get to Canada or a place where there was a Polish recruiting station. They were never allowed, the Polish Army, to recruit actively in the United States. So soldiers could come to Canada and join the Polish Army. Then again, for many cases, even though they may have had the desire, their country's at war and they're being conscripted or they're being mobilized, so they may have been seen as deserters coming up. So the numbers were actually fairly small coming to the States. Nothing against the fighting. As I mentioned, 12% of the American Army was of Polish descent, so that's a massive contribution. But the numbers who came up to Canada and signed up in Windsor and other places is very small.
So I would just add that the window was extremely small. So we know that the Polish government asked Canada in September 1939 to consider setting up Polish Army. It took a year and a half in negotiations. So by the time it kicked off, it was now May 1941. And so the numbers were small. As we say, about 1,000 recruits from Windsor, Owen Sound went. 73% of them were American. Two events happened that really finished off the recruitment of Americans. Number one, the United States went to war in December 1941, so that kind of closed off a window right there as they got into their own conscription. And then the need for North American volunteers diminished in 1942 as the Polish Second Corps was being formed. So there was, as I say, a short window. Those two events really shrank the window. And then other studies will say that as much as Polish Americans had fighting spirit, and as Robert was saying, contributed a big part to the U.S. forces, a lot of studies say that young Polish American men were a little reluctant to join the Polish forces up in Canada because of the experience of their fathers in the First World War. So we did hear that over 20,000 Polish Americans joined the Polish army being formed in Niagara-on-the-Lake in the First World War. Well, that's a great story. It's a great story of, you know, how they joined. They went to France. But we don't hear the sad story at the end, because they ended up in Poland and it became extremely difficult for them to get back to the USA. They were treated rather shabbily. It's a long, long story. Many of them died of illness in various camps. It could be transportation back. And that may have left a sour taste in the mouths of these families that had a hard time getting back to the United States after the First World War. So I think those two historical events, U.S. entry into the war, formation of Anders' army, and then just maybe the attitude, might explain why there was a low number of Polish-American volunteers.
In the first World War, as the second, the U.S. government was not very eager to promote the Polish army. You have to keep in mind. The Canadian allowed the British to form Polish army at the territory of Canada. Even politically, the United States profoundly expressed the interest to create the Poland in terms of recruit the army. The United States was very limited, almost impossible. That was on an administrations. United States general government, administration, global affairs, not promote the ethnic sort of background army. But the Poles are about 3% of the US as ethnic group. There was 9% of the Poles recruited to the US Army. More than 12% was casualties. So typical direct combat unit, which really reflects the ethnics. So Canada did the part of allow us, still as a British subjects in 1918, to recruit. That was a very helpful for us. No doubt. In the First War, they didn't play the role, but they played diplomatically. Being used by Dmowski, as we discussed with General, during the Versailles Committee and Conference, to raise the questions on which side the Polish fought during the First War. But Piłsudski was on part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, that Dmowski raised, sorry, he's the 100,000 men of the Polish descent that been on the French side. So it was diplomatic. It was a great success in terms of the military as a completely. The second war almost repeated. Okay? So that's
If I could just add to that, Ed, there was no Canadian citizenship, as we know, until came in effect in late 1946, and the first citizens January 1947. So Poles who came to Canada prior to that, if they knew, because they got to Canada and went to work, most of them, the migrations between the wars and prior to the First War was primarily rural, and so people went to work. If they had not applied for British subject status, they were automatically going to be conscripted. And so if a Pole had come to Canada and married a British subject, a lady, she immediately lost her British subject status, whether she knew that or not. And so if this individual is conscripted and goes to war and is killed, she is stateless. And there were cases where some of the women who married Polish fellows, they went to England, the guy was killed in action. They couldn't get back to Canada. It wasn't just the Poles, but there were many cases like that. Some of them were finally settled in the 1990s. As far as whose citizenship and which one do you have. So it was, because Canada was British subject is my point, it was easier for us to get agreement with Britain, where Britain is saying the first to fight were the Poles. They need citizens. The British did not let the Poles conscript in Britain. But in Canada, yes, so, finite. But the whole issue of citizenship came back to haunt later, because who are you? And if you didn't know you had to apply for British subject status when you arrived in Canada, you could be in real jeopardy, and that's saying nothing about your patriotism to Canada, Poland, or whatever country you originated in. Some of the material in the archives is extraordinary, which again is one of those stories not well known in our country, Canada, that is.
Excuse me, I'd just like to make a comment to the citizenship issue in the United States. While there was no citizens of Canada until the 40s, in 47, there was citizenship in the United States. And according to the then Polish citizenship law of 1921, anyone who obtained a citizenship of a foreign country automatically lost its Polish citizenship. So any American citizen of Polish descent who wanted to join the Polish army was not a Polish citizen.
Thank you very much. And the last question? Sir?
I'd like to hear your thoughts on the impact of the massacre of the Polish officers on the effectiveness of the Polish fighting forces. Because many of us in this room are retired military officers, and we know it takes a long, long time to grow an officer to reach to a certain point of competence to be able to be effective in battle. The trained troops, much less, but for officers it takes a long time. I know the Polish officers were very, very high caliber. Everything I've always read has always said they were like superstar officers, but they lost so many of them in Katyn and the other places. So was there a study, or what was the effect on the actual fighting forces after having lost that high caliber of officers?
It's another great question, thank you. So I think first of all, who were the officers that were murdered at Katyn in Kharkov? The large majority were actually reserve officers. So these were Polish officers that had had First World War experience in the Polish Bolshevik War. Then, they left the army. Some of, again, we're talking about these reserve, they left the army, they were all still in the military reserves. They were mobilized in 1939. A lot of them ended up in eastern Poland when they were mobilized reserve officers, because this was the place where Poland was supposed to be the last stand against the German invasion. They weren't expecting an invasion by the Soviets. So it was when the Soviets did invade and they captured these reserve officers. We're talking people that were doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, professors, and so on. Yes, there were some professional military officers among the prisoners, but I think the fundamental tragedy for Poland is not so much the military talent as it was the leadership and intellectual talent. And that is one of the main reasons why Stalin wanted these officers executed. So there would be no hope that their talents and leadership could resurrect a Polish nation. So that is, so I would say, yes, there were some generals and other career officers that were murdered, but the story that most people don't realize, these were reserve officers that had had very prominent civilian careers up until the time of the war. Now, the second point is in terms of its impact on Polish military leadership. So first of all, when those officers were POWs, there was no forethinking that they would ever become officers again. They were the prisoners of the Soviets. It wasn't until the German invasion of the Soviet Union and Stalin's agreement to allow the formation of a Polish army that now the absence of these officers was noticed and felt. And I'll leave it to one of the other panelists to say maybe how that affected the Second Corps, because as I said during my talk, as the Poles were coming from all over the Soviet Union to join the army, they realized there were a lot of officers missing. But the other thing maybe that I want to reemphasize from my talk is that for the Polish army now that was formed later under Soviet command, as I mentioned, there was a lot of Polish officer absence, and a lot of Soviet Russian-speaking officers took leadership positions, which led to high amount of casualties of Polish soldiers. So that's definitely one impact. And I'll leave it to one of my colleagues to talk about maybe the impact on the Second Corps.
Thank you. If I can, a couple of comments. The officers who were murdered and buried in a number of places, including Katyn Forest, of the 23,000, many of them were specialists besides reservists. So you've got, as in Dr. Jablonski's uncle, who was the geographic specialist, the guy who does the maps. And a lot of doctors, priests, lawyers, etc. Border forces, looked upon perhaps in the West as, what do you mean border? These were military forces, very effectively, and fought effectively till the end. Where it particularly hurt the Polish army in reconstituting was at the level of major lieutenant colonel, unit commanders. Junior officers, you can train quickly. There was an abundance because there was good talent. If you've survived 2 years in Russia, you will be okay. Somehow you will be okay as a lieutenant. You will fight well, and they did. The high casualties that Edward mentioned about on the Eastern Front was just from that. We're inexperienced. There were the language issues. We have Russian-speaking officers who, even if they did speak Polish, which most did, they wouldn't care because these were not Russians. So there was not really any interest to study the language. And the extermination of the Polish intelligentsia was probably the plan. General officers were killed in Katyn. and were in the other camps, Starobielsk camps. And amongst all of the victims in Katyn, one would be remiss not to mention Poruchik Janina Lewandowska, who was a pilot, and the only woman in Katyn, the daughter of John Dobromostitsky. And the sad sequel to that story is that besides the fact that she was murdered on her birthday, was that her husband, who was also a pilot, survived to fight in the West and committed suicide in 1964, never getting over her loss. So specialist intelligentsia and at the major lieutenant colonel rank level was where it really hurt, and that's why lessons were learned. Lots of great lessons were learned in the 3rd Carpathian Brigade in Africa, as mentioned by Edward, where people were taken and moved into different units because not that they were kicked out of the units, newly formed larger units, divisional side, needed that experience that was gained in Africa from Carpathian Rifles, and that's how they managed to make it up. Machik's division, lots of officers, again, lacking the experience at the senior level. And you had individuals rise up quickly. And when a major battalion commander was killed, Lachitsky was killed in the Falaise, it hurt. People may say he was only a major. He was one of the few that had the experience, and very few had staff college training. So it's a matter of that survived. They'd gone either to the Vysoké Školy Wojskowe in Warsaw or Paris for the military academy. And perhaps little known is that interwar years in Poland, to attend military academy, you had to qualify in French. Because the French army organized and helped run Polish military academy. General de Gaulle, as a junior officer, spent more time in Poland than he did on the Western Front. So it was organized. The lack of that, and how to organize and logistically support the units at the larger level, that was missing. There's nothing about desire to fight and competence in the field, but the ability to organize and move large formations is where it really hurt.
I'd just like to mention that about 66 Polish generals got killed during the Second World War. Some of them got killed in the Katyn massacre, because in fact Stalin was trying to make some revenge of some already retired officers, and he also arrested retired officers and killed them purposely because they participated in the Polish Bolshevik War. I also like to mention, and among specialists, in Katyn massacre, all chaplaincy of high-rank officers of chaplaincy of Polish army got essentially erased or killed, including not only Biskup Polowy, the Polish Armed Forces Bishop of Catholic Rite, but also great rabbin of the Polish army who also got killed. The Mufti, who was of Polish Tatars, also got killed, and also Protestant chaplain, high order, high rank officer also got killed. So all officers who served in Polish army chaplaincy also got killed in Katyn massacre, which really was a symbol of destruction of the old Poland, because old Poland, they tried to accommodate all multi-phase character of population and also Polish army.
A short commentary to this question. I think you all know that the decision of the liquidation of the camps of Polish officers in Kozielsk, Starobielsk, and Kozielsk, Starobielsk, and Ostaszków, yes. Sorry, this decision was taken in February 1940. The decision was prepared in February, but taken on the session of the Polish Bureau on the 5th of March 1940. But it was prepared by Beria, the chief of the NKVD, in the end of February. And we must remember that the group of more than 400 officers was selected and resettled to the internment in the camp in Grazowice, yes? And we know that between them was, for instance, Józef Taski, who was mentioned here today in our discussion. But my comment is limited to one question. We must not forget that all Polish officers in these three camps, Ostaszków, Kozielsk and Starobielsk, were examined by Soviet secret services, by Soviet intelligence, and all of them had own enquête, and he was examined in the camp, and all these papers were probably destroyed in 1957. It was decided by the Soviet Politburo in 1957 after Khrushchev accession to power, and this is probable that this decision is probable. But there is a second story that this documentation exists in the archives of Russia now, but any historian had and has no access to these papers. And in this situation, we had no concrete possibilities to judge what were the criteria for the selection of this group. This is cardinal question for historians. Thank you.
I'd just like to comment because I was involved in some searches of some documentation in Polish military archives. And at that time, this was just after rebirth of the Free Poland. This was, I think, in 1991 or 1992, when I went with my cousin near Warsaw. There is a place when this national military archives are being stored. We got access relatively easy, and we were trying to find some names of our officers from our family, and we were looking also for this major who was killed in Katyn. We couldn't find it. So finally they moved up to one place, which was a small room, and in a small room there were cards, because it was like in all library, there was cards like this, and they have different color. So we asked this young lady in uniform, why this is a separate and it has a different color. He said, well, this was people who were observed by the Polish Communist Secret Service. I say, well, my uncle got killed. Doesn't matter, because we observed the whole family, immediate family of this person. That's why he was taken from the military archive and put to the separate room, okay? What was interesting, that Germans, they captured all Polish military archives and they moved them to Gdańsk, I think, during the wartime. And they use it, of course, for persecution and searches of some military who escape, you know, imprisonment or POW camps in Poland. And after the war, this archive was taken by Soviets, because Soviets, they managed, the Germans, they didn't destroy this archive, and the Soviets, they used this archive to prosecute everybody who had the connections to these officers. And finally, they came back to the same location near Warsaw, and I think they're being right now under control of the new government, and you can have a free access, because we managed to have a free access. But we were surprised that we got some problems to find some information.
Thank you very much. I'm always impressed by the... Sure. Yes, in closing comments, in a moment. I'm impressed, you know, by the individual and collective knowledge of our speakers. So maybe Dr. Kornicki will start, you know...
Just how profoundly affect the killing of the Polish officer in Katyn, Anders definitely, to the end of his life. Sosnkowski jest, Sikorski more and less. He acted more as a politician, to be also the generals. But Anders to the end was profoundly affected. His decisions, his military decisions, Even the Monte Cassino, to some extent, reflections his idea that we have to solve the Soviets' propaganda that we already fought against the Germans. Definitely. But also, I want to a little bit disagree with John Williams about the Massacre. It's true that the summer officer was in the combat, but a lot of them are in combat in September 1949, then in the French campaign, and seems to me that was I talked to the officer in United States, beginning of the 90s, to happen to be the officer, and they ranks to the generals under the pattern. And the pattern is around the officer is extremely praised not only the bravery, but also the skills of General Massacre. I'm not if it's true or not, but the pattern says to all generals, if I have a division like Massacre, I will end up in Berlin a few weeks. I don't know if it's true, but it maybe not been written. But he really prized Massacre, and I think they did a lot of, in terms of increasing the power of the Canadian Army. The Canadian Army really fought very bravely, and what's more important, the Canadian top command, General Simons and General Cowley, to prove to the British mainly, but also to the Americans, they can command the large units of the army. And the Falas, including the Massacre, proved to a lot of top commanders of the British Army as well as to the American that Canada and Canadian officer can command successfully huge units of that. And Massacre was the part of this very successful under the Canadian command.
Yeah, and my point is not that they're not successfully commanding, it's the support under them. Massacre and some of his key staff officers like Skibinski and a few others were forced to do a lot more work than they normally would have because their subordinates did not have the understanding of how to move large formations. They did not have that experience, simple fact. Nothing against bravery or military prowess, they were great. But when it came to planning the operations, Massacre was intimately involved because he had gone to staff college, so did Skibinski, many others, but they had a whole level of junior majors because they had to move up ranks as they expanded. They didn't have the background plan. That was my point. It's not about combat effectiveness. Massacre, and certainly first Bishop and Senator Division proved its worth in spades. It perhaps could have even gone better. And when I look more at the effect of the decimation and murder of the Polish officer corps, I'm thinking more about second corps, where expanding from the 3rd Carpathian, suddenly you have the 3rd Division Karpacki and then the 5th Krajowa Division Piechota. You've got 2 divisions, and then the 2nd Armored Brigade, which expands to a division as well. You don't have that level of staff that has training how to maneuver a 381 tank division, how you put it on tank transporters. That experience was missing, that's all. That was my only point.
I would say the first few days of the campaign of Kalas was actually destroyed by the friendly fire from Air Force, US and British mainly. And it was a little bit chaotic, I would say, among the Canadian as well as the Poles.
Right, it caused chaos. Yeah, it caused chaos.
But they go forward. They reach the objective. They go to the hill, and they really defied. So they was able, the Poles and Canadian and the 5th Army of Patton from the south tackled the route from the German SS unit Panzer Elite to escape. So the Poles for a few times was actually surrendered by the Germans. They never give up, from the north as well as from the south. So that was a great success. And no doubt there was even you expressed this, I would say, a lack of communication of the language program, or of the language problem. It's still, if you're in the field, that's what I understand from the people who really part of these Massacre divisions, they act as a soldiers, okay? And they was very successful. The German, more or less, actually the main core of the German SS unit elite was destroyed. They lose this offensive capacity, and from the past, actually, generals, they only have this defensive units.
Yeah, I'm not doubting the prowess. When you look at Massacre's division came under command on the 1st of August. He met Simmons on the 4th of August.
Yeah.
The soldiers never met the Canadians in 4th Armored Division, period, until they went into battle. So when you're operating alongside an allied unit, which the Poles and Canadians are, They didn't know each other well enough to even understand what the tanks, because they had Churchills, not always Shermans. Uniforms, procedures, that was missing. In a large formations, the Poles, in this case, in Second Corps, as they became part of the minority, 15,000. Logistics support was provided by the Canadian Corps, so that was looked after. If the Polish Corps, as in Italy, was operating so quasi-independently, they had to look after all of their own logistics. That sort of ability to plan logistics is what was missing. Those people were gone that had been trained at the Wyszczegłowa in Warsaw. That hurt. It did not, the combat effectiveness, fortunately, Second Polish Corps was either part of 5th Army or 8th Army at various times. So fortunately, it had a larger corps or an army that could help in the logistics, but that's where it really hurt. You're on a foreign territory as well, so you can't buy things. So it did not detract the combat effectiveness, but resupply. And when you get issues like the infamous Massacre, the carrying artillery.
Before the fight, actually the British and the Americans decided that we have to, give the Polish divisions the marching, because we have to reinforce or strengthen the capacity, offensive capacity of Canadian. So it's a very quick period of time. The British and the top generals, I guess Eisenhower, figured out the Canadian cannot make it. So we have to add the Polish divisions Massacre to improve the offensive capacity of the Canadian. Well, it was a few days of
General Simmons asked for additional armor. The one available was the Poles. One of my points of contention with the British and Canadian military Second War is Massacre started forming the division in January 1942. It was never assigned to anybody until the 1st of August 1944. Why not? To get to know people, to go in with the Canadians. You say, right, you're going to fight with the Canadians, alongside, not with them. That's back to the, the bars and the fight. But it's the ability to get to know people, understand how they operate, exchange liaison officers, communications, have exercises where you work through the difficulties. That was left, to my mind, too late. They did very well, given all the rough, but it's too late to meet your ally when you're under fire. To go, well, who are you? Massacre, you don't speak English. No, Simmons or French or something. Yeah. And so it worked very well despite that, but in a longer term effort, in a larger scale, without their own ability to plan movement of that force, and I'm not talking fighting, I'm talking moving it across through the bocage, fuel, etc. That planning ability had been decimated in the
the whole supply been left 2 days back, but it was really. I'm not sure if the Massacre was really responsible for supply, because as the chief commander of the...
I invite you to a discussion after the symposium. Right now what I'd like to ask is for closing comments. Okay.
One last word I can. Rommel said that as commander of the Africa Corps, he was not responsible for supply. Well, if you're moving across distance, you need to consider it. You have supply people that help you. But if you just hope that you get supplied. Hope is not a course of action. It's a belief in life that it'll get better. What Rommel did plan on was capturing British vehicles and retiring them. And in the Africa Corps campaign, 85% of the trucks he used were British. Yeah. And so they made good use of it. Polish mechanics were brilliant as well for using German equipment captured. But planning factors is how many trucks does it take, how long to get the fuel. Normandy, the floating bridges, the mulberry bridges, and everything, to get fuel across the canal, how much do you need, where do you need it? Yeah. Massacre's trying to exploit, he'd love to get all the way to Warsaw, we know that. He's keeping going, he's advancing fast, and he's running out of fuel.
Like Patton.
Yeah, but it's his staff to say we can only go so far, that bit was missing. The desire was there for sure, and they did well, but at a point, we ran out of fuel and ammunition when the Poles did, and had to be resupplied forcibly by 4th Canadian Army. They were reluctant to give up theirs, to their shame, and they did, and the division commander was fired. The Canadian division commander was fired for not cooperating with General Massacre.
Yeah, and I wish, they ended up actually in Warsaw, saving Poland from Soviet Union. So right now, in closing, I'd like to invite Professor Marek Kornat and then following distinguished guests for one thought that you would like to leave us with.
I
No other questions. Thank you very much for the session, for the invitation. I think we had good opportunity to return to our history, to our common history, but only one idea seems me necessary to be raised. 1939 is a turning point in our history, and I think that every anniversary of the outbreak of the war is a good opportunity to return to this tragic story in our history. And the second problem was the contribution of the Polish soldiers to the ultimate victory of the Allies, and I think that both of them are the good topics for one conference, so to say. We have the tragedy of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the partition of the country, and the testimony of the existence of Polish question, of Polish army, of Polish soldiers, of Polish political thought after the terrible defeat. This is the participation of Polish soldiers in the military movement during the war. They testify this Polish vitality. Thank you very much.
If I may conclude, I would say we talk about Poland, September, and a lot of tragedy, but also it's a very important here for the Polish community, for the Canadian, also for me personally, to understand the importance of Canadian soldiers, Canadian army involved in the First War and then Second War. Occasionally we sometimes talking about our heroes, but they sacrifice incredible, okay? And they prove that the top commander can lead top units to the success, great military success like this Palace and the Normandy campaign. And we really are very honored to see General Williams represent the Canadian Army to be in this seminar and event. So we have to remember that Canada also, their performance and their sacrifice during the war too. That's what I can think.
To certainly echo those comments, and my one last comment would be a plea to the audience where a government in a country that went into exile, Polonia in the diaspora, the archives are things that are often missing and perhaps missing forever. And so I had, about 10 years ago, an aunt of mine, elderly aunt, her friend who had married a Polish officer, Canadian lady. He passed, he kept everything. He was in 5th Division in Monte Cassino. He had aerial photograph of Monte Cassino, maps, signed operations orders, everything. So when I say to people, make sure copies get to Poland, to the archives, to the Sikorski Institute in London, and to the Canadians, so that these archives can at least be explored by future generations. And that comes to things like as simple as identification cards, driver's licenses, documents for the Palestine campaign, Ken card, these sort of things. These documents are part of history that people will not understand unless they're preserved. So when I always put the call out and I say, we will get them to Poland so they can preserve these. I have, say, a signed operation order by Anders that I made sure they got to Poland. I couldn't believe this. I had a suitcase full of documents, including all the paper documents. And when his family said, can you tell us what he did? Because he never spoke Polish at home. He had the Virtuti Militari, the Order of the British Empire, amongst many other decorations. They had no idea what he did. So I translated everything for the family and said, here's what your father did. They were quite amazed. And his uniforms, they passed them to me for safekeeping until I get them to the right spot. The uniforms he wore as an officer in the 5th Division with all of the insignia, all of the carte de legitimatia with every medal he had, including his parachute wings. Astounding. The preservation of these documents, because so much was destroyed, as mentioned with Dr. Wojcicki, and things that as historians we're looking at to make the picture, these are human beings, and where are the documents related to those who were in Starobelsk, Ostashkov, and Kozelsk? Where are the documents? It puts a face to it, and important that generations remember that. I think as historians we always plead that, but mine is, if in doubt, we'll make sure we can get the documents. These need to be preserved so they can at least be examined by future generations. What did this mean? It may not seem important, but some of the paperwork is quite extraordinary. You see the signatures or what was meant to do. That's my thoughts.
Thank you very much. I do want to begin again by repeating my thanks to the organizers, especially my colleague, Dr. Jaboyski. This has been an amazing, enriching symposium. I'm impressed with the commitment of everybody on this panel. My thought, my takeaway thought, I think I want to echo something Professor Massacre said, that 1939 was a turning point. I think for anybody who has Polish roots, this can't be denied. In my particular case, I am born in Canada as a consequence of the Second World War. My father and my grandmother came to Canada in 1947, so it was part of, you know, they were part of that wave. But my grandfather and my uncle actually were among the Poles that made it to Canada in 1941. And so I think that the 1939 really changed everything. I've been touched by the family experiences that have been shared here by the panelists. And I guess in closing, what I want to say, I think that all the communication problems with General Matchik's division would have been solved had a young, newly minted junior officer named Zdzisław Poznański hadn't been wounded in his first day in battle at Falaise. So he was a real hero to me. He came to Canada in 1941. He was one of the few that joined the Polish Army in Canada. He went to the 1st Polish Army Division. He was in battle for 1 day at Falaise, severely wounded, never went back into action. But I can tell you, if he's like any other Poznański, he would have solved communication problems.
Because I was one of the organizers, I can't really say any special concluding word, but I like to thank all panelists, I think, for this very enlightening for me and very special emotional symposium. I must say that for my family, of course, 1939 was a turning point, like for almost for each Polish family, because this was the end of the era of the old Poland, and it was never really resurrected in this specific multinational, multi-phase type of way, you know, when Poles used to live before 1939. Because the Second Polish Republic was a continuation of the First Polish Republic to some extent. And this was never resurrected because we experienced such a heavy losses. We rebuilt our nation after the Second World War, and now we are in the process of regaining our identity. And this is due to the current leadership, political leadership of Poland, that we are trying to regain our identity as a nation, trying to find a good place among other nations, and trying also to find a place in the whole region, together with other friends from Baltic states, from Finland, from Ukraine, from Belarus, and Romania. All of these states and whole Central and Eastern Europe was affected because of these tragic events and invasion from both sides. So thank you very much, and God bless you.
So before I thank everybody, I would like to thank, of course, our distinguished speakers for this enriching seminar. I really appreciate, because I learned a lot from every one of you. Every presentation, I believe, made our knowledge greater about the subject, and it's not something I found in the books or easily on the internet. So thank you really, really so much. I appreciate that. Now I'd like to hand out to our distinguished speakers, along with Hania, certificates of appreciation. So the first one presented to Professor Marek Karna.
The second one to Dr. Andrzej Kurnicki.
certificate of appreciation presented to pan Edward Poznański.
And Brigadier General retired Robert Williams.
Also to Mr. Andris Kisteris.
And the President of the Institute of Oscar Halecki, Dr. Alexander Mathieu-Bois.
Who organized this symposium. Is a titan of war.
It was not signed by myself.
No, it was not. I signed it on behalf of the institute.
Christopher, who is vice president.
He's so modest in the end.
I have to follow to the end the decision of the board of directors that we handed in, and I decided not to have it. I say, yeah, you have to have it. So I said, well, I'm not going to sign for myself. So I asked my friend to sign it.
Let's give him a hand one more time. He fully deserves it.